It is, in these times, in some ways, a topsy-turvy world in which we live. Those who support free speech about politicians, issues, and democracy are routinely referred to as threats to democracy. And office holders who take up the mantle of political freedom are excoriated by newspapers whose very existence depends on their right to speak. And those office holders will find it difficult to gain the endorsement of those newspapers and publications unless they support limits on free speech, at least limits for everyone else, of course. And so it seemed only right to us at CCP that we ought to be doing more to recognize those few who do fight hard and bravely for our First Amendment rights. And thus, we've decided to inaugurate this year here at our 10th anniversary dinner our first Madison Award. Now, I can think of a number of people right here in this room, and if it actually weren't for these lights, I could probably see a number of people in this room who would be worthy recipients of this recognition. But for us, it was still an easy choice to present our first James Madison Freedom of Speech Award to Senator Mitch McConnell. For 3 decades now, Senator McConnell has fought this fight with tenacity and with principle in the Senate and in the courts. One of the many battles that Senator McConnell took on in this long fight, and I'm not going to even begin to recite them all, except for to note that virtually every legislative win we've had, whether we're playing offense or defense, is owed to Senator McConnell. But one of the fights he took on was to promote an obscure law professor from an obscure Midwestern university to fill a Republican seat on the FEC. That's me. If I was obscure to most people in the GOP and in Washington at the time, I was not obscure to the speech regulatory community, which denounced that nomination and sought to block it. And I recall one day after a weekend in which the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the venomous Al Hunt had attacked my nomination in editorials, Senator McConnell called me at my home in Ohio, in the ironically named Clintonville, where I lived. And he asked how I was holding up, you doing okay? And I said, fine. And then I remember he said, "Now, Brad, there's going to be more of this. And this is no time to get weak-kneed." And I recall thinking, well, why would I get weak-kneed? I mean, you're doing all the work. You're out there in Ohio catching all the flack. I'm just sitting at my home. So I remember I said something to the effect of, Senator, I'm fine. And eventually to the effect of, look, I'm proud and happy to be your nominee until you tell me it's time to withdraw. And there was kind of a pause there on the phone for a minute, and then he said, there is no plan B. And I can tell you that in the long fight over that nomination and in my years, better part of a decade on the FEC, Senator McConnell never discussed with me partisan goals or particular FEC policies. He never discussed GOP electoral prospects or the role of the FEC that might be played there. All he asked consistently was that I continue to write and speak publicly on the issue and use that position not only to shape a better law, but as a platform to make the constitutional case for free speech. And in a sense, it was that determination to place me on the FEC that ultimately led to the creation of CCP, and that's what brings us all together tonight. So again, I won't try to recite all the different things that Senator McConnell has done on this issue. Instead, I just want to say this. It is very easy for a public official to defend things that are unpopular. It is very difficult to defend ideas, it's very easy to defend ideas, that are popular. Now, to get this right or you really butcher it. It's very difficult to defend ideas that are unpopular and to be attacked every day by the papers in your home state, by the papers here in the Capitol and around the country because of the position that one takes. And Senator Mitch McConnell has been willing to take that unpopular stand for decades on behalf of First Amendment rights. James Madison is generally recognized as the author of the Bill of Rights, so I'm very proud and pleased to present our first Madison Freedom of Speech Award to Senator Mitch McConnell. Now, Senator, I have to say, we had originally planned a $1 million cash prize, but unfortunately, Senate ethics rules required us to scale that back by $999,650, I believe was the amount. So instead, what we're going to give you is just 4 cents. That is to say, it is a first edition 1938 James Madison 4-cent stamp, the only Madison stamp ever produced for daily use, based on a sculpture by Frederick William Sievers. It's here on an envelope, you can see it down here next to me, that is postmarked on the first day of issue in 1938, and the envelope is signed by the sculptor Sievers, by the engraver Leo Kaufman, by James Vail, who did the lettering on the stamp, by the Postmaster General James Farley, and finally by V.C. Burke, who was the Washington, D.C. postmaster who canceled the stamp, and whom we might note was a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and began his career as assistant postmaster in Louisville. The description from CCP on this reads simply, in appreciation for your tireless work supporting the First Amendment rights to free political speech for all Americans. So it is with my tremendous gratitude for all you've done, and I think the gratitude of everybody in this room, that we are going to present you with this award. Please help me welcome U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Well, thank you very much, Brad. My definition of fun is to be in a room like this with a bunch of campaign finance junkies. We all have a passion for an arcane subject that almost nobody understands and is extraordinarily difficult to explain in a soundbite. I first got interested in this issue. I was a young lawyer. I wasn't making enough money, and I decided to teach part-time at the University of Louisville, an undergraduate course called American Political Parties and Elections. It happened to be about the time of the Buckley decision. And as I went into that class and began to prepare my lectures, I had all the biases that were common in the post-Watergate period about what needed to be done. And the more I read and the more I learned, the more I concluded this was an absurd bill that was in effect designed to allow elected officials to write the rules of the game in a way that would benefit themselves and disadvantage their opponents. And of course, you can imagine the temptation. If you can draw the rules of the game, you're more likely to win. And of course, we know who was writing the rules at the time. It was a very, very liberal Congress with a view that private involvement in the political process was a pernicious thing, and it needed to be, of course, regulated by the state. And then I became a politician myself and had to work with the myriad rules and regulations and all the rest. And so by the time I came to the Senate, I want you to know there was not a whole lot of competition to be the campaign finance guy. In fact, one of my colleagues called me the designated spear catcher. Everybody wanted, on our side at least, everybody wanted us to prevail and these pieces of legislation not pass. But nobody wanted any fingerprints on it. They were more than happy to let me be the leader, and I was, just an obscure backbencher in the first term. And in fact, I can remember when you walk to the Senate floor, if you've ever been outside the Senate floor, there are just coveys of reporters everywhere. And my greatest aspiration during my first term was that some reporter sometime would stop me and ask me what I thought about anything. So I was about as obscure as you could get. In fact, we do a lot by seniority, not everything, a lot by seniority, and you may know that even includes the locations of the desk on the Senate floor. So when I first got there, I was dead last on the Republican side, and by the time it came my lot to pick my location on the floor, of course, I had the very last seat already over back in the corner where the light's not very good. And We almost never sit where we're supposed to, but occasionally we do. And the first time I was sitting where I was supposed to, everybody else was. Bob Dole was down in the best seat. I looked around the room and I thought to myself, none of these people are ever going to die. Retire or be defeated. But alas, it took me a while, but I have a much better seat now. So anyway, there was no clamoring during my first term to become sort of the expert on this subject. And so I had the field to myself. But of course, in order to prevail in the Senate, particularly if you're trying to kill something, you need to be able to get at least 41 people to follow you. And so we had a number of episodes over the years. The one I remember the most fondly, we were within 6 weeks of the 1994 Republican sweep. At that point, the greatest Republican congressional election in anybody's memory, and we flipped the House for the first time in 40 years. We killed Hillary Kerr in August. We were feeling our oats. George Mitchell was the majority leader. The House had passed a campaign finance bill. The Senate had passed one. It included spending limits for congressional elections. Jan is shaking his head. And taxpayer funding. And we were within 2 months of the election. And so I went to the parliamentarian and I said they needed to go to conference. They had not worked it out between the House and Senate yet. And I remember our parliamentary advisors, not actually the parliamentarian, I was talking to him, and I said, what does it take to go to conference? And he said, well, it takes 3 motions. I said, are they debatable? And he said, yeah, but nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever done that. So I said, why not? And he said, well, it just isn't done. And so I decided to see if I could pull off the following. In the Senate, post-cloture, there are 30 hours more after you get cloture. But in the post-cloture period, each senator can only get 1 hour. So in order to organize a post-cloture filibuster, you have got to have a lot of help. With all due respect to Senator Dole, he wasn't necessarily opposed to what I was trying to achieve. He just didn't think we had a chance. So I worked hard all night. We got people lined up. We invoked cloture, burned the 30 hours, and we had 30 people show up right on time all night long. And I used that 30 hours to convince a few Democrats to vote with us. And then on the second motion, we switched and we defeated cloture, and George Mitchell gave up. So the only reason I bring it up is not to pat myself on the back, but to let you know this is something I feel passionately about. Because so that was the high point. The low point was when we had a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, and McCain-Feingold passed. That wasn't what I had in mind for a Republican House and a Republican Senate and a Republican president. I told President Bush I loved him like a brother, but the 2 biggest mistakes he made was naming the Justice Department after Bobby Kennedy and signing McCain-Feingold. And so I became the plaintiff. And there are a number of lawyers here in the room who worked with me, not only in that case, where my lawyers in that particular case were Ted Olson and Floyd Abrams, but I see Bobby Birchfield here. We've done 10 amicus briefs. And as earlier speakers alluded, what really began to turn the corner on political speech issues was Sam Alito replacing Sandra Day O'Connor. Abrams, Starr, and everybody on the plaintiff side in McCain-Feingold and McConnell versus FEC, my name on that law, that decision has been quite embarrassing for quite a while. But everything was geared toward trying to get Justice O'Connor. and we failed. So in 2006, when Justice Alito replaced Justice O'Connor, as all of you junkies know, we've had a series of very significant victories. There was no more gratifying moment than Citizens United. Nothing I enjoyed more than seeing the President of the United States shaking his finger at the Supreme Court, sitting right there in front of him. And the way they misrepresented what that case was all about, as all of you fellow travelers know, it was only about corporate speech. It was only about whether the New York Times has a preferred position, a corporation that can say anything it wants to at any point up until the day of the election without government interference. But if you're a corporation not lucky enough to own a media outlet, you can't. All they did was level the field for corporate speech. It wasn't nearly as big a change as it was portrayed. So I'm pretty darn happy about where we are now. Speech is breaking out all over. The liberals are going berserk. Groups are getting organized. Some of them like me, some of them don't, but they've all got a right to have their say. And there's a lot of hand-wringing and dismay on the left these days because of all this speech. And why is all this speech breaking out? A government this big is having an adverse impact on so many Americans that they want to do something about it. Not just hire lobbyists, that's fine, the town's full of them. Some of them are here tonight. But also to try to beat people who are creating this monster. And the way you do that is you win elections. And elections are not the sole proprietorship of the parties and the candidates. We don't get to control the speech. There are a whole lot of people out there that want to comment on what's going on. Some like us and some don't. But under the First Amendment, we shouldn't be able to determine who gets to speak and who doesn't, to dole out speech in some measurable amount and hand it to whoever we like. It's impermissible. Also through this issue, I got to meet my favorite Princeton graduate, who's also on the program tonight. George Will, like everybody else, didn't know who the hell I was. But one day on the phone, they said, "This is George Will." I said, "You mean George who?" "George Will, the columnist?" "Yeah." He called because he had an interest and a passion in the same issue that I did. That, coupled with baseball, have produced a friendship of 25 years, and I can't think of anybody I'd rather be here tonight with than George Will, who's the greatest writer in the country, bar none, and provides inspiration for those of us who are in the battle on a virtual daily basis. He's also one Princetonian that they're not trying to erase symbols of. I'm a little worried about Princeton, and I'm sure you are. I don't know what's going on up there. I was not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. I share George Will's view of Woodrow Wilson, but to argue that he wasn't a significant graduate of Princeton is absurd. So I don't know what's happening at Princeton, but it's an honor to be here with George tonight, and I can't thank you all enough for, Brad, for what you've done here. This is really, really important. I want to leave on a cautionary note. The liberals have taken over 8 of the 11 circuits. We've had a great run here since Citizens United in court. But there's nothing they'd like better than to shut us all down and to keep us from speaking out. But we're still on offense. And in the omnibus bill that we're putting together in the Congress, I have inserted one of my longtime pet peeves, which is, for you junkies, you remember Colorado 1 allowed the national party committees to engage in independent expenditures. We went back to the Supreme Court in Colorado 2 and said, why should a party committee which exists only for the purpose of electing its candidates not be able to do anything it wants to in direct coordination with the candidates? I mean, why should the government micromanage how the parties spend their money? Well, we lost Colorado 2. we're going to try in the omnibus appropriation bill to eliminate Colorado 2. To my astonishment, as several of us have been talking, some conservative groups have decided they're against this. I can't understand it. But we're going to try very hard to achieve that so that the political parties can spend their money as they see fit on whatever races they think are the most important. Of what business is it of the government to tell national political parties how to spend their money? The only reason I bring that up is we're now on offense. We're going to be on offense in the courts. You all are helping with that enormously. We're going to be on offense in the Congress as well. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed being here tonight. Can't wait to hear from George.